The morning air held a precise temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying with it a sharp, biting moisture that clung to the damp earth of the Blackwood estate, an expanse of 14,000 acres of untamed forest that had belonged to the Blackmore lineage for exactly 312 years. Duke Alexander Blackmore stood motionless at the edge of the northern clearing, his breathing regulated to exactly 12 inhalations per minute, his pulse a steady, unwavering 58 beats per second, or rather, 58 beats per minute, meticulously controlled by a mind that refused to yield to the chaotic impulses of adrenaline that possessed the lesser aristocrats floundering through the woods behind him. The hunt was an annual spectacle, a grotesque theatre of dominance where 74 invited noblemen, dressed in garish coats of scarlet and gold, pretended to conquer nature while relying entirely on the labour of 120 beaters and 45 tracking hounds. Alexander despised the noise, the crude scent of fear mixed with overpriced cologne, the agonizingly predictable chatter of men who measured their worth in inherited titles rather than actual competence. He held his bespoke rifle, a masterpiece of engineering weighing exactly 8.4 pounds, the walnut stock carved to perfectly match the dimensions of his right shoulder, the trigger mechanism calibrated to break at precisely 2.5 pounds of pressure. He was a man of absolute, terrifying logic, a mathematician of death who observed the world through the lens of physics, trajectory, and behavioral predictability, devoid of the sentimental rot that clouded the judgment of humanity. For the past 2 hours and 17 minutes, he had separated himself from the main hunting party, advancing silently through the dense underbrush, his polished leather boots displacing exactly enough soil to mask his footsteps beneath the ambient rustling of the oak leaves. He was tracking a specific creature, a massive, feral wild boar that had terrorized the local tenant farms for the past 42 days, leaving a trail of ruined crops and 3 severely injured hunting dogs. Alexander had analyzed the beast's movements, calculating its territory based on the distribution of its tracks, the depth of its hoofprints, and the 73 distinct markings left on the trunks of pine trees where it sharpened its tusks. He knew the animal weighed roughly 380 pounds, possessed a muscle density that could deflect a poorly aimed caliber, and operated on a pure, unadulterated instinct for violence. As the silver pocket watch in his tailored hunting waistcoat ticked away the seconds, reading precisely 9:14 and 36 seconds in the morning, the dense thicket 30 yards ahead began to tremble. Alexander's eyes, a shade of slate grey that mirrored the overcast sky, locked onto the exact coordinates of the disturbance. His mind immediately processed the variables. The wind was blowing from the northwest at a velocity of 4.2 miles per hour, adjusting the humidity to 68%, factors that would marginally affect the drop of his bullet over a distance of 90 feet. He raised the rifle in a fluid, perfectly optimized motion that took exactly 0.8 seconds, the cheek rest meeting his jawbone with familiar, comforting solidity. Through the iron sights, the shadowy mass of the boar materialized, its coarse, bristling hair coated in dried mud, its red-rimmed eyes scanning the clearing with raw, primal fury. It was a magnificent specimen of brutality, its twin tusks curving upwards like jagged ivory daggers, measuring an estimated 7.5 inches in length. Alexander's index finger slid into the trigger guard, resting lightly against the curved metal, applying the first 1.2 pounds of pressure necessary to take up the slack in the mechanism. He calculated the optimal point of entry, a circular area roughly 2.8 inches in diameter located just behind the creature's left shoulder blade, an angle that would ensure the bullet shattered the scapula and obliterated the heart, inducing massive hydrostatic shock and achieving total organ failure within 4.3 seconds. The boar let out a low, guttural snort, a sound that vibrated at a frequency that sent a primal warning through the damp air, and its heavily muscled legs coiled beneath its immense bulk, preparing to launch itself forward in a devastating charge. Alexander's breathing ceased altogether. His body became a living extension of the weapon, perfectly still, perfectly lethal, entirely devoid of hesitation or empathy. His finger tightened, applying 1.9 pounds of pressure, 2.0 pounds, 2.1 pounds. The world narrowed to a solitary, mathematically perfect point of termination. Then exactly 1.4 seconds before the rifle was destined to discharge, a sudden, incomprehensible anomaly invaded the precisely calculated parameters of Alexander's field of vision. From the periphery of his left eye, emerging from behind the thick trunk of a massive ancient oak tree located 22 yards away, a figure stepped directly into the clearing, perfectly bisecting the lethal vector between the muzzle of the Duke's rifle and the charging mass of the wild boar. Alexander's brain, a highly efficient engine of logic, experienced a microscopic fraction of a second of profound cognitive dissonance. The figure was human, a woman, specifically a servant, dressed in the coarse, unbleached linen of a scullery maid, the fabric faded from exactly 340 washes, her apron bearing the faint, indelible stains of ash and root vegetables. It was Clara. Alexander did not know her name, nor had he ever committed her entirely unremarkable face to his memory during the 8 months and 12 days she had been employed at the estate, rendering her statistically insignificant to the grand equation of his daily existence. Yet here she was, standing exactly 46 feet away from him, her thin, fragile frame positioned with terrifying exactitude in the direct path of a 380-pound beast that was currently accelerating to a speed of 24 feet per second. The mathematical impossibility of her presence struck Alexander like a physical blow. She had no reason to be in the northern woods, a restricted hunting zone located exactly 1.7 miles from the kitchens, where she was contractually obligated to be peeling exactly 400 potatoes for the evening banquet. More staggeringly, she was entirely unarmed, possessing neither the physical mass to deflect the boar nor the velocity to escape its trajectory. As the beast registered her presence, letting out a deafening metallic squeal of rage, it pivoted slightly, locking its murderous intent upon her frail silhouette. Alexander's finger hovered at 2.4 pounds of pressure. The absolute certainty of the situation dictated that he complete the pull. The bullet, traveling at a velocity of 2,800 feet per second, would pass cleanly through the maid's upper torso, causing instantaneous, catastrophic tissue damage, before continuing on to strike the boar, neutralizing the primary threat while sacrificing a highly replaceable asset. It was the logical choice, the utilitarian calculus of survival. But as Alexander's slate-grey eyes focused on the servant, the magnification of his intense concentration revealed a sequence of micro-expressions and physical adaptations that shattered his entire understanding of human psychology. Clara was not screaming, she was not flailing. Her heart rate, which should have spiked to 160 beats per minute in a paroxysm of terminal panic, seemed completely regulated. Her stance was not defensive. Her feet were planted exactly shoulder-width apart, her knees bent at a slight stabilizing angle of roughly 12 degrees, grounding her center of gravity against the damp earth. Her hands, rough and calloused from endless hours of invisible labor, were raised softly in front of her, palms facing the charging beast, in an ancient, universally understood gesture of pacification that was utterly, profoundly useless against an apex predator. But it was her face that caused the cold, calculating machinery of Alexander's mind to forcefully disengage. Her features were delicate, pale, framed by loose strands of light brown hair that had escaped her starched white cap. But her eyes, large, luminous, and possessing a depth of color akin to polished amber, were locked onto the boar, not with terror, but with an agonizing, incandescent empathy. She was not looking at a monster. She was looking at a creature trapped in the violent theater of aristocrats, a terrified, bleeding animal cornered by 100 hounds. Her jaw was set, her lips parted in a silent, continuous breath, projecting a silent, suicidal will to protect the very beast that was 41/10 of a second away from tearing her internal organs out through her ribcage. The bravery was not born of ignorance. The slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her right pinky finger and the rapid dilation of her pupils, measuring exactly 6 millimeters, indicated that she was fully, acutely aware of her impending disembowelment. Yet she refused to move. She refused to yield exactly 1 inch of ground. This insignificant, invisible maid had actively, consciously chosen to sacrifice her 89-pound body to shield a feral pig from a high-caliber execution. The sheer, irrational magnitude of her selflessness created a catastrophic error in Alexander's logical processing. He could calculate wind speed, bullet drop, kinetic energy, and predatory behavior, but he possessed no formula for this level of profound, quiet sacrifice. With exactly 0.3 seconds remaining before the boar made contact, Alexander's highly disciplined reflexes executed an emergency override. Instead of pulling the trigger, his arms contracted with explosive force, jerking the 8.4-pound rifle sharply upward and to the right, adjusting the trajectory by an angle of 28 degrees. He yanked the trigger, applying the remaining 0.1 pounds of pressure. The rifle detonated with a deafening concussive roar that reached 160 decibels, shattering the morning silence. The bullet erupted from the muzzle, tearing through the frigid air, passing exactly 7 inches above the boar's skull and obliterating the trunk of a dying birch tree located 30 yards behind the animal. The explosive sound of the gunshot, magnified by the dense canopy of the forest, hit the charging boar with the physical force of a shockwave. The beast, its primitive nervous system instantly overwhelmed by the auditory trauma and the spray of wooden shrapnel directly in its path, aborted its charge with a frantic, uncoordinated scramble of its hooves, tearing up deep gouges of dark soil before veering violently to the left, plunging wildly into the dense brambles and vanishing from sight within exactly 4.2 seconds. The sudden absence of violence left a heavy, suffocating vacuum in the clearing. The air was thick with the acrid metallic scent of burnt gunpowder, slowly drifting in a pale blue cloud that dissipated against the damp leaves. Alexander lowered the smoking rifle, his chest expanding as he drew his first breath in 34 seconds. His heart, normally a metronome of icy detachment, was now beating at an alarming 94 beats per minute, the highest recorded rate since he was 19 years old. His knuckles were bone white as they gripped the walnut stock, the residual vibration of the shot still humming through his forearms. He stood perfectly still, his tall, imposing figure radiating a silent, dangerous intensity. His slate-grey eyes fixed entirely upon the small, trembling figure standing 22 yards away. Clara remained frozen in her defensive stance, her arms still raised, her chest heaving as she inhaled exactly 22 rapid breaths in the span of 30 seconds. The adrenaline that she had so miraculously suppressed during the confrontation was now flooding her system, causing a visible, rhythmic shivering in her shoulders and a profound pallor to overtake her complexion. She slowly lowered her hands, the rough fabric of her sleeves brushing against her apron, and turned her head to look directly at the Duke. For a duration of exactly 14 seconds, total silence reigned between the apex predator of the aristocratic world and the lowest rung of its servitude. Alexander scrutinized her with the terrifying precision of a coroner examining a baffling anomaly. He noted the exact trajectory of a single drop of sweat tracing the curve of her left temple, the faint, purplish shadows beneath her amber eyes indicating chronic sleep deprivation, and the minute, complex tension in her jawline that spoke of a lifetime of suppressing her own voice. She did not fall to her knees in gratitude. She did not weep hysterically or beg for forgiveness for interrupting the hunt of the highest-ranking nobleman in the county. Instead, Clara executed a slow, deeply respectful curtsy, lowering her center of gravity by exactly 8 inches, her gaze dropping to the mud-caked tips of Alexander's leather boots. It was a gesture of total subservience, entirely at odds with the godlike defiance she had exhibited mere seconds before. When she rose, she did not look at his face, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, turned on her worn, thin-soled leather shoes, and began walking back toward the southern edge of the estate, taking exactly 32 steps before disappearing completely into the dense, foggy tree line. Alexander did not attempt to stop her. He did not issue a command or demand an explanation. He merely stood there, the cold wind biting at his exposed cheeks, his mind running a frantic, disorganized sequence of calculations, trying to quantify what had just occurred. A maid, a creature of zero social consequence, possessed a psychological fortitude that completely eclipsed the combined courage of the 74 aristocrats currently fumbling through the woods behind him. The sheer, terrifying beauty of her irrationality had fundamentally compromised his deeply held belief in the absolute supremacy of logic. He realized with a creeping, undeniable certainty that registered in his mind with the clarity of a newly discovered mathematical axiom that he needed to understand her. He needed to dismantle the architecture of her mind, to measure the exact depth of her empathy, to calculate the precise origin of her suicidal bravery. As he smoothly operated the bolt of his rifle, ejecting the spent brass casing which landed on the damp earth with a dull, final click, Duke Alexander Blackmore made a decision that would permanently alter the trajectory of exactly 312 years of aristocratic tradition. He was no longer hunting the boar. The target had changed. The journey back to the main house of the Blackwood estate took exactly 47 minutes, comprising precisely 4,218 steps, measured with the unrelenting consistency of a pendulum. Duke Alexander Blackmore strode through the increasingly manicured paths of the southern woods, his 8.4-pound rifle slung over his right shoulder, an invisible tether seemingly pulling his highly rational mind back toward the anomaly he had witnessed. When he finally emerged from the tree line onto the expansive, immaculately kept lawns that swept toward the towering stone facade of his ancestral home, the atmosphere was already corrupted by the grotesque theater of aristocratic failure. The hunting party had returned. 74 noblemen, smelling of stale brandy, frightened horses and damp wool, were scattered across the gravel courtyard, loudly recounting exaggerated tales of near misses and complaining about the density of the underbrush. Alexander observed them with a cold, clinical detachment, noting the exact microscopic twitches of their facial muscles that betrayed their underlying cowardice. Lord Harrington was currently boasting about tracking a beast for 3 miles, yet Alexander's slate-grey eyes quickly calculated the absolute lack of mud on the man's polished riding boots, and the fact that his pulse, visible at the carotid artery, was resting at a sedentary 72 beats per minute. They were all useless, a collective mass of inherited privilege and zero utility, utterly incapable of surviving outside the heavily padded confines of their drawing rooms. As Alexander handed his rifle to a waiting footman, who received the weapon with exactly 2 degrees of trembling in his gloved hands, he bypassed the chaotic assembly without uttering a single syllable of greeting. He retreated to his private study, a cavernous room located in the West Wing, lined with exactly 4,822 volumes of philosophy, mathematics, and military strategy. He locked the heavy oak door, the brass mechanism engaging with a solid, satisfying click, and walked over to the massive mahogany desk that dominated the center of the room. For exactly 3 hours and 14 minutes, he sat in complete silence, a silver pen poised above a blank sheet of heavy parchment, attempting to mathematically dissect the psychological architecture of the servant girl. He listed the variables: subject, female, age, estimated between 19 and 22, height, approximately 5 feet and 4 inches, weight, 89 pounds, threat level, 0, protective instinct, absolute. The numbers refused to align into a logical sequence. The survival instinct was the most fundamental biological imperative, hardwired into the cerebral cortex of every living organism, dictating that a creature must prioritize its own existence above all else. Yet Clara had overridden this primal programming with a terrifying, instantaneous choice. She had calculated the value of her own life and deemed it exactly equal to, or perhaps lesser than, the life of a destructive, feral beast. Alexander's pen hovered over the paper, his mind reconstructing the exact geometry of her stance, the precise dilation of her 6-millimeter pupils, the agonizing empathy radiating from her amber eyes. The anomaly was not merely an error in judgment. It was a profound, quiet rebellion against the fundamental laws of nature. He needed empirical data. He needed to observe her in her natural environment to determine if this was a singular, erratic lapse in sanity or the manifestation of a deeply ingrained psychological strength that he had entirely overlooked. At precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Alexander executed the first phase of his investigation. He summoned the head housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, a stern, heavily starched woman who had managed the estate's staff of 142 servants for the past 19 years. She stood before his desk, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly at exactly waist height, clearly terrified by the unprecedented summons to the Duke's inner sanctum. Alexander did not look at her directly, his gaze fixed on a geometric pattern woven into the Persian rug, counting exactly 14 red threads intersecting with 12 blue ones, before speaking his first words of the day. He demanded the personnel records of the scullery maids, specifically requesting the identity of a young woman with light brown hair and amber eyes, who was assigned to the kitchen staff. Mrs. Higgins, momentarily paralyzed by the absolute strangeness of the request, quickly processed the description, her mind scanning the lowest ranks of the invisible workforce that kept the estate functioning. Within exactly 22 seconds, she produced a name: Clara. No surname recorded. Hired 8 months and 12 days ago from a local parish orphanage. Assigned to the lowest tier of domestic labor, responsible for scrubbing pots, hauling water, and disposing of kitchen refuse. Alexander dismissed the housekeeper with a brief, terrifying wave of his hand, entirely indifferent to her profound confusion. Over the next 7 days, representing 168 consecutive hours, Alexander initiated a methodical, covert surveillance operation that completely dismantled the rigid, predictable routine of his aristocratic existence. He abandoned his usual schedule of reviewing agricultural yields, dismissing his estate managers with curt, monosyllabic commands, and instead positioned himself in locations strategically calculated to intersect with Clara's daily movements. He utilized the labyrinthine network of service corridors, narrow passageways built into the walls of the estate, designed to render the servants completely invisible to the nobility. Alexander, a man who commanded thousands of acres and dictated the economic fate of an entire county, now stood perfectly still in dark, drafty hallways, peering through small, grated ventilation shafts, observing the grueling, microscopic details of a scullery maid's life. He began to compile a massive mental ledger of her actions. Clara awoke every morning at exactly 4:15, a full 2 hours and 45 minutes before the sun breached the horizon. She slept in a cramped, unheated dormitory shared with 5 other maids, her thin woolen blanket offering a thermal resistance factor that Alexander calculated was entirely insufficient to prevent mild hypothermia. Yet she never complained. He watched her perform her duties with a mesmerizing, silent efficiency. Between the hours of 5 and 8 in the morning, she scrubbed precisely 184 iron pots and copper pans, immersing her hands in water that reached a scalding temperature of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Alexander noted the angry, raw redness of her skin, the tiny, meticulously wrapped bandages covering exactly 4 distinct cuts on her fingers, injuries sustained from broken crockery and sharp knives hastily discarded by the senior cooks. He observed her interactions with the other servants, applying his clinical analysis to the social hierarchy of the kitchen. The kitchen was a brutal, chaotic ecosystem, a microcosm of the very aristocratic world Alexander despised, ruled by a tyrannical head chef who communicated entirely through shouting and physical intimidation. Clara was the absolute lowest rung on this ladder, the designated recipient of every mistake, every delay, and every burst of misplaced anger. Yet her reaction was entirely consistent with the anomaly he had witnessed in the forest. When the head chef hurled a heavy silver soup tureen at the stone floor, shattering it into exactly 46 pieces and screaming obscenities at Clara for a delay that was mathematically impossible for her to have caused, she did not flinch. Her pulse, which Alexander could observe by focusing intensely on the slight flutter of the pale skin at the base of her throat, remained completely steady. She simply knelt on the cold, hard flagstones, her knees absorbing the impact, and began gathering the sharp, jagged shards with her bare hands, her face devoid of resentment, radiating only a quiet, profound endurance. The most terrifying aspect of her existence, Alexander realized on the 4th day of his observation, was her absolute invisibility. She moved through the grand halls of the estate like a ghost, delivering coal to the fireplaces, scrubbing the marble floors until they gleamed with a mathematically perfect reflection, existing entirely in the peripheral vision of the inhabitants. The aristocrats who populated his home looked right through her, treating her with less consideration than they afforded the wooden furniture. Lord Harrington once walked directly into her while she was carrying a towering stack of freshly laundered linen, sending exactly 22 folded sheets tumbling to the floor. The nobleman didn't even pause to acknowledge her existence, merely sidestepping the pile and continuing his inane conversation about horse breeding. Alexander, observing this from a shadowed alcove 20 feet away, felt a sudden, violent spike in his own adrenaline, his jaw clenching with a force of roughly 200 pounds per square inch, an entirely illogical urge to cross the room and physically dismantle Lord Harrington's aristocratic arrogance. He suppressed the impulse, calculating the social ramifications of such an action, but the incident left a permanent, searing mark on his psyche. He was becoming obsessed not just with her bravery, but with the massive, suffocating injustice of her reality. On the evening of the 7th day, at precisely 11:45, Alexander made a discovery that shattered the final lingering doubts he harbored regarding the depth of her empathy. He was observing her from a concealed vantage point near the rear entrance of the kitchens. The rest of the staff had retired to their quarters 35 minutes prior, leaving Clara alone to complete the final grueling task of scrubbing the massive grease-stained butcher's block. The temperature in the stone room had dropped to 48 degrees. Clara finished her work, wiping her raw, blistered hands on her apron, but instead of heading toward the stairs leading to the servants' dormitory, she quietly unlatched the heavy wooden back door and slipped out into the frigid, moonlit courtyard. Alexander immediately adjusted his position, his stealth honed by years of hunting, following her at a precise distance of 40 yards, utilizing the deep shadows cast by the towering hedgerows. She moved quickly, her small, worn shoes making almost zero noise on the damp cobblestones, heading toward a dilapidated, unused storage shed located at the absolute edge of the estate grounds. Alexander positioned himself behind a thick oak tree, leaning slightly to achieve a clear line of sight through the cracked, dirty window of the shed. What he saw inside defied every logical parameter of human behavior. The shed was illuminated by a single, flickering candle, providing a luminous intensity of exactly 1 candela. Huddled in the corner, nestled within a small pile of dry straw, was a stray dog, a mangy, emaciated terrier mix that appeared to be suffering from a severe laceration on its left hind leg. Clara knelt beside the animal, completely disregarding the filth and the potential for disease, her amber eyes radiating the exact same incandescent empathy he had witnessed in the clearing. From the deep pockets of her faded apron, she produced exactly 3 small, slightly stale dinner rolls and a small, cracked bowl of leftover beef broth that she must have painstakingly smuggled from the kitchen, risking severe punishment or immediate dismissal. She spoke softly, her voice barely registering above 20 decibels, a gentle, soothing cadence that seemed to instantly lower the animal's defensive posture. She carefully cleaned the wound with a small piece of clean cloth, her movements possessing a microscopic delicacy, applying a rudimentary salve made from crushed herbs that she must have gathered from the estate's gardens. The dog, which initially bared its teeth in fear, slowly relaxed, emitting a low, grateful whine, resting its head against her knee. Alexander stood paralyzed in the freezing darkness, his slate-grey eyes fixed on the scene, processing a tidal wave of incomprehensible data. This girl, who existed on exactly 900 calories a day, who slept in freezing temperatures, who was subjected to the daily, grinding humiliation of absolute servitude, was utilizing her microscopic sliver of free time and her meager stolen resources to protect and heal an animal that offered her absolutely nothing in return. Her capacity for compassion was not merely a reaction to extreme stress, as it had been with the boar. It was a fundamental, deeply ingrained principle of her existence. She possessed a structural integrity of character that completely dwarfed the superficial, heavily orchestrated morality of the entire British aristocracy. She was a titan disguised as a ghost. The cold wind bit through Alexander's tailored wool coat, but he did not feel it. His highly analytical mind, previously dedicated to the ruthless optimization of his wealth and power, was currently undergoing a catastrophic, irreversible paradigm shift. He calculated the exact amount of money he had spent on the previous week's hunt. Roughly £4,500, an expenditure designed solely to destroy life for the sake of entertainment. Simultaneously, he calculated the value of the 3 stale rolls and the bowl of broth that Clara had risked everything to provide, a value of perhaps 3 pennies, an expenditure designed solely to preserve life in the darkest, most forgotten corner of his estate. The mathematical disparity was sickening. It was a profound, damning indictment of his entire reality. For the first time in exactly 29 years of highly regulated, emotionally detached existence, Duke Alexander Blackmore felt the cold, hard ice of his logic cracking, splintering under the immense, undeniable pressure of awe. He watched her gently stroke the dog's head exactly 14 times before slowly rising, extinguishing the candle, and slipping back out into the night. Alexander remained hidden, perfectly still, his heart beating a steady, rhythmic drum against his ribs, realizing that the psychological breakdown he had sought to understand in her was, in fact, happening entirely within himself. The target had indeed changed, but the objective was no longer observation. It was comprehension, proximity, and an increasingly terrifying desire to completely dismantle the invisible barriers that separated the apex predator from the quiet, invincible protector. The game of observation was over. The meticulous, calculated approach was about to begin. The transition from passive observation to active, calculated insertion into Clara's reality required a sequence of logistical maneuvers that Duke Alexander Blackmore executed with the precision of a military campaign. The first phase involved the systemic dismantling of the brutal parameters that governed the servants' quarters, a structural hierarchy that he now viewed with profound mathematical disgust. At precisely 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 12 days after the incident in the northern woods, Alexander summoned his estate manager, Mr. Thornton, to his study. Thornton, a man who had built his career on maximizing profit by minimizing the operational costs of the Blackwood estate, presented a ledger detailing a projected saving of £412 for the fiscal quarter. Alexander did not look at the ledger. Instead, he stared at Thornton with a terrifying, unblinking intensity, calculating the exact amount of oxygen the man was wasting with his self-congratulatory speech. With a voice perfectly modulated to a quiet, lethal volume of 45 decibels, Alexander issued a series of commands that permanently altered the thermal and nutritional economics of the estate. The temperature in the servants' dormitories, previously hovering at a miserable 42 degrees, was to be immediately elevated and maintained at a constant, medically optimal 68 degrees, requiring the immediate requisition of 12 additional tons of high-grade coal per month. The caloric intake of the scullery maids was to be increased from an estimated 900 calories to a mandatory 2,400 calories per day, featuring a mandatory inclusion of fresh proteins and vitamin-rich vegetables. Furthermore, the head chef, a man who possessed a horrifying tendency to hurl ceramic objects at an 89-pound girl, was terminated on the spot, his contract severed with exactly 0 days of notice, accompanied by a chilling, highly specific threat regarding legal consequences should he ever step foot within a 50-mile radius of the property again. Thornton, his face draining of all colour, attempted to stutter a protest regarding the sudden, massive expenditure, but a single infinitesimal narrowing of Alexander's slate-grey eyes, reducing the aperture of his gaze by precisely 2 millimeters, instantly silenced the manager, compelling him to back out of the room with a rapid, terrified scramble. The atmospheric shifts within the estate manifested within exactly 48 hours. Alexander monitored the changes from his shadows, observing Clara's reactions. The arrival of new, thick woolen blankets, possessing a thermal resistance perfectly calibrated to block drafts, caused a microscopic but profound shift in her posture. The chronic underlying tension that gripped her shoulders began to dissipate, her spine straightening by exactly half an inch. When she was served her first radically altered meal, a thick stew containing exactly 4 ounces of premium beef and heavily buttered bread, she did not devour it immediately. Alexander, watching through a cracked ventilation grate above the dining hall, noted that she stared at the bowl for exactly 38 seconds, her highly adaptive mind attempting to process the sudden, incomprehensible deviation from her brutal reality. She slowly raised a spoonful to her lips, chewing deliberately, her amber eyes widening by a fraction of a millimeter as the unfamiliar rush of complex nutrients flooded her chronically deprived system. Yet she did not smile. She simply consumed the meal with quiet, profound gratitude, her empathy immediately transferring to the stray dog in the shed, as she meticulously wrapped exactly half of her portion in a clean linen cloth, secreting it away within the deep pockets of her apron. Alexander realized that indirect environmental manipulation was insufficient. He needed physical proximity. He needed to measure the exact frequency of her voice, the chemical composition of the air when she occupied a room, the precise electrical current of her presence. He calculated the exact trajectory of her afternoon duties and orchestrated an interception. At precisely 3:14 in the afternoon, Clara was tasked with replacing the massive beeswax candles in the Grand Library, a cavernous room containing 52 towering shelves and smelling of aged leather and dry parchment. She moved silently, placing the new candles into the heavy brass candelabras, her movements efficient and practiced, taking exactly 14 seconds per fixture. Alexander sat in a high-backed leather wing chair in the darkest corner of the room, completely still, a large leather-bound volume of advanced calculus resting open on his lap, unread. He had positioned himself exactly 24 feet from her projected path. As she approached his sector of the room, he closed the book with a deliberate sharp snap that echoed like a gunshot in the silent library. Clara stopped instantly, her body freezing with the instinctual rigidity of prey, detecting a predator. Her gaze dropping to the floor, her breathing pausing for exactly 2.8 seconds. She executed a perfect, deeply submissive curtsy, her knees bending at an 80-degree angle. Alexander rose from his chair, his tall, imposing frame casting a long, sharp shadow across the Persian rug. He calculated the physical distance between them, stepping forward, reducing the gap from 24 feet to exactly 12 feet. He stopped. He did not want to trigger her flight response, maintaining a distance that his mathematical model suggested was the absolute minimum threshold for perceived safety. "You are the one from the woods," Alexander stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated with a terrifying calmness, dispensing entirely with the theatrical formalities of aristocratic address. The words hung in the dusty air, heavy and absolute. Clara did not look up. Her hands, rough and permanently scarred, tightened almost imperceptibly against the coarse fabric of her apron, her knuckles turning a faint shade of white. She inhaled a shallow breath, preparing to speak, the muscles in her throat working against the immense, crushing weight of social impossibility. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her voice registering at barely 30 decibels, a soft, incredibly pure sound that possessed a slightly raspy quality from a lifetime of underuse. It was exactly 3 syllables. It was the first time he had heard her speak, and the auditory data was instantly categorized, analyzed, and permanently burned into his neural pathways. The frequency was mesmerizing, completely devoid of the shrill, manipulative inflections utilized by the noblewomen who constantly sought his attention. It was a voice composed entirely of truth and exhaustion. Alexander took another deliberate step forward, closing the distance to 8 feet. "You calculated the velocity of the boar," he said, framing his observation as an undeniable fact rather than a question. "You understood the mass. You understood the lethality. You possessed no physical means of defense, yet you inserted your 89-pound frame directly into its trajectory. Why?" The question was a demand for logical data, a requirement for her to explain the mathematical impossibility of her bravery. Clara's breathing accelerated slightly, reaching 18 breaths per minute. She remained entirely still, her gaze fixed with unwavering intensity on the polished toe of his left boot. The silence stretched for exactly 14 seconds, a terrifying void that Alexander allowed to expand, refusing to fill it with impatience. Finally she spoke, her voice trembling with an agonizing raw honesty that completely bypassed all societal protocols. "Because, Your Grace," she murmured, her words woven with a profound, quiet sorrow, "the creature was terrified. It did not understand the nature of the game. It was simply trying to survive a violence it did not create. I could not stand by and allow it to be destroyed for a cruelty it did not comprehend." Alexander's highly disciplined mind experienced a violent, catastrophic system failure. Her response contained exactly 39 words, and every single one of them struck the foundational architecture of his worldview with the force of a battering ram. She had not acted out of ignorance, nor out of a desperate, panicked reflex. She had operated on a moral logic that was so unimaginably pure, so terrifyingly empathetic, that it completely invalidated the entire aristocratic construct of power and dominance. She had seen through the grand artificial theatre of the hunt and recognized the fundamental bleeding reality of suffering. He closed the distance to exactly 3 feet. He was now close enough to detect the faint, clean scent of lye soap on her skin and the microscopic trembling of her lower lip. He towered over her, a dark, imposing force of intellectual supremacy, yet he felt entirely, inexplicably humbled. "Look at me," he commanded, the volume of his voice dropping to a whisper that possessed the gravity of a physical law. Clara hesitated for exactly 2.4 seconds. The societal conditioning that demanded her absolute submission warred violently against the impossible command of the Duke. Slowly, painfully, she raised her head. The movement was a glacial, terrifying defiance of her invisible status. Her amber eyes, wide, luminous, and brimming with an unspeakable depth of emotional intelligence, finally met his slate-grey gaze. The visual connection was instantaneous and explosive. Alexander felt a physical jolt, a surge of pure, unfiltered electricity that bypassed his analytical defenses and struck directly at his core. He was staring into the eyes of a titan, a woman whose internal fortitude was forged in the absolute darkest, most unforgiving depths of human existence, yet who had somehow retained a capacity for compassion that burned with the intensity of a dying star. He analyzed the micro-expressions on her face. There was fear, certainly. Her pulse was visible, beating rapidly against her pale throat. But there was also a staggering, quiet defiance. She was not asking for permission to exist. She was simply presenting the undeniable truth of her reality. "You possess a profound structural flaw, Clara," Alexander said, his voice dropping into a register of dangerous, possessive intimacy. "Your capacity for empathy is entirely incompatible with the environment you occupy. It is a mathematical certainty that this world will destroy you if you continue to act as a shield for its victims." Clara's gaze did not waver. The trembling in her lips ceased, her posture locked into a rigid, unbreakable line of pure resilience. "Then I will be destroyed, Your Grace," she replied, her voice gaining a fractional increase in volume, the words ringing with a terrifying, absolute finality. "But I will not yield. I will not become a participant in the cruelty, simply because it is the mathematically safer option." The conversation consisted of precisely 114 words, exchanged over a duration of 2 minutes and 42 seconds. Yet it completely dismantled the 312 years of aristocratic history that separated them. Alexander realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that the highly structured, logical world he had built around himself was nothing but a fragile, superficial illusion, a massive, heavily fortified prison designed to keep out the very reality that Clara embodied. He did not merely want to observe her anymore, he wanted to possess her strength. He wanted to shatter the invisible barriers that confined her to the damp, freezing corridors of the estate, and elevate her to the absolute pinnacle of his world, forcing the garish, useless nobility to kneel before a woman whose moral architecture was infinitely superior to their inherited titles. The transition from obsession to total, unyielding devotion was instantaneous, a massive, permanent recalculation of his life's trajectory. Alexander stepped back, expanding the distance to 6 feet, his slate-grey eyes locking onto hers with a dark, blazing intensity. He gave her a single, curt nod, turned and strode out of the library, his mind already formulating a highly complex, devastatingly precise strategy to execute the final, explosive phase of his psychological warfare against the aristocracy. The game was no longer about survival, it was about absolute total conquest, and Clara was the weapon he intended to unleash upon the world. The final phase of Duke Alexander Blackmore's calculated psychological siege against the deeply entrenched hypocritical architecture of his own aristocratic society was engineered with a level of terrifying precision typically reserved for the annihilation of enemy states. The vector for this destruction was the annual Blackwood Winter Solstice Ball, an event of staggering superficiality that demanded the attendance of exactly 340 of the highest-ranking nobles in the country. The preparation required 22 days of relentless logistical execution. Alexander commanded the complete transformation of the Grand Ballroom, a massive architectural cavern measuring exactly 120 feet in length and 65 feet in width. He ordered the installation of precisely 1,440 beeswax candles, strategically positioned to eliminate any shadow, ensuring that the impending exposure of the aristocracy's moral bankruptcy would occur under a blinding, mathematically perfect illumination. He calculated the exact acoustic resonance of the chamber, instructing the 40-piece orchestra to play at a strictly regulated tempo of 72 beats per minute, a rhythm designed to match the average human resting heart rate, thereby subliminally inducing a false sense of security among the guests. But the true weapon, the absolute centerpiece of his devastating strategy, was Clara. Extracting her from the invisibility of the scullery required a carefully modulated, highly controlled sequence of events to prevent a catastrophic psychological shock to her system. 13 days before the ball, Alexander summoned Madame Villette, the most ruthless and precise modiste in London, to the estate. He provided her with a single sheet of heavy parchment containing exactly 24 highly specific measurements he had visually calculated during his interactions with Clara, down to the millimeter. He demanded a gown constructed from exactly 22 yards of midnight blue silk, a fabric so dense and lustrous it seemed to absorb light, requiring an estimated 42,000 individual stitches to complete. The design was entirely devoid of the garish lace, absurd hoops, and frivolous embellishments that characterized the current aristocratic fashion. It was a garment of pure, structural elegance, designed to armor her entirely in her own profound simplicity. When Clara was presented with the gown in a private, newly assigned suite on the 3rd floor, a room maintained at a constant 68 degrees and featuring a bed constructed with exactly 4 layers of premium down, she stared at the garment for exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds, her pulse spiking to 110 beats per minute. Alexander stood in the doorway, observing the complex mathematical equation of her terror and awe. She understood the implication. To wear the garment was to cross the absolute impermeable boundary of her existence, to step from the shadows directly into the lethal, blinding epicenter of a world that considered her less than human. She turned to him, her amber eyes wide, her hands trembling with a force that caused a visible vibration in her fingertips. "You are asking me to walk into a cage of predators, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice tight with a raw, undeniable fear, the sentence consisting of 11 precisely articulated words. Alexander crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping exactly 18 inches from her. "They are not predators, Clara," he replied, his voice a low, resonant hum of absolute, terrifying certainty. "They are parasites. They possess 0 structural integrity. You are the only titan in this estate. I'm simply providing you with the armor necessary to make your true nature visible to their primitive, highly defective minds. You will not yield. You will simply exist, and your mere existence will completely dismantle them." The night of the ball arrived with a freezing, crystalline clarity, the outside temperature dropping to exactly 19 degrees Fahrenheit. By 9:30 in the evening, the Grand Ballroom was operating at maximum capacity, filled with the suffocating stench of exotic perfumes and the utterly meaningless, high-frequency chatter of 340 aristocrats. Alexander stood at the apex of the grand marble staircase, his slate-grey eyes scanning the crowd, calculating the exact distribution of vanity and arrogance. Lord Harrington was holding court near the punch bowl, recounting another fabricated tale of his hunting prowess, his jaw moving with a predictable mechanical idiocy. Lady Windermere was sneering at the floral arrangements, her face contorted by a lifetime of systemic dissatisfaction. They were a collective mass of highly predictable, utterly useless data points. At precisely 10 o'clock, the exact hour Alexander had mathematically determined, the crowd would reach peak complacency. The massive mahogany doors at the top of the staircase opened. The acoustic shift in the room was instantaneous. The heavy, resonant thud of the doors striking the marble walls severed the background noise like a guillotine. The orchestra, following Alexander's precise instructions, ceased playing entirely, leaving a terrifying, absolute silence that stretched for exactly 4.8 seconds. Into this vacuum, Clara emerged. She stood at the top of the 72 marble steps, the midnight blue silk of her gown cascading around her small, 89-pound frame with the heavy, undeniable gravity of a collapsing star. Her light brown hair was swept up into a severe, elegant architecture, entirely exposing the pale, fragile column of her neck. But it was her face that arrested the collective breath of the room. She was terrified. Alexander could see the microscopic tremor in her lower lip and the rapid, shallow rise of her chest as she inhaled precisely 20 times a minute, but she did not break. Her amber eyes, possessing that impossible incandescent empathy, swept over the crowd of aristocrats, recognizing them not as masters, but as the same terrified, trapped creatures she had seen in the wild boar. She radiated a quiet, devastatingly pure strength that completely overwhelmed the superficial glitter of the entire assembly. A collective, involuntary gasp ripped through the ballroom, registering at exactly 65 decibels. The aristocrats, their primitive social algorithms catastrophically short-circuiting, stared in paralyzed incomprehension. They recognized the face, the invisible ghost who scrubbed their floors and hauled their coal, but the presentation completely shattered their cognitive parameters. Alexander did not give them time to recover. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and offered his right hand. Clara looked at his hand for exactly 2.1 seconds. The silence in the room had become a physical pressure, suffocating and heavy. Slowly, with an agonizingly beautiful defiance, she raised her rough, permanently calloused hand, a hand scarred by scalding water and jagged pottery, and placed it into his. The physical contact was an electrical detonation. Alexander felt the slight roughness of her skin against his palm, a tactile confirmation of her unyielding endurance. He led her down the 72 steps, the descent taking exactly 1 minute and 14 seconds, a slow, deliberate march that forced every single aristocrat to watch the complete annihilation of their social hierarchy. As they reached the bottom step, the crowd involuntarily parted, creating a path exactly 10 feet wide, driven back by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the psychological force emanating from the couple. Lord Harrington, his face flushed a violent shade of crimson, stepped forward, his mouth opening to vomit an insult, his highly defective brain attempting to reassert dominance. "Your Grace," Harrington stammered, his voice vibrating with a shrill, panic-induced outrage. "This is a grotesque insult. You bring a scullery maid, a creature of the dirt, into our presence. This is a violation of every law of our society." Alexander stopped. He slowly turned his head to lock his slate-grey eyes onto Harrington. He calculated the exact angle of Harrington's posture, the rapid, terrified flutter of his pulse at the base of his throat, the microscopic beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Alexander did not shout. He did not lose his temper. He simply deployed his logic like a surgical blade. "Lord Harrington," Alexander said, his voice a low, lethal hum that carried effortlessly to the furthest corners of the 120-foot room, ensuring that exactly 339 other people heard every single syllable. You boast of tracking beasts, yet you cannot tolerate the dampness of the grass. You claim superiority based on a lineage you did nothing to earn and a wealth you lack the intellect to manage. The woman standing beside me possesses a psychological fortitude that completely dwarfs your entire existence. Exactly 35 days ago, she deliberately placed her own body between my discharging rifle and a charging 380-pound wild boar, entirely unarmed, solely to prevent an act of violence she deemed unnecessary. You, on the other hand, require 3 armed footmen to assist you in dismounting a horse. Do not presume to speak of laws or society. In the geometry of actual human value, you are a negative integer, and she is the absolute sum. The silence that followed was total. It was a suffocating absolute zero of sound. Harrington's face drained of all colour, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish, utterly demolished by the cold, undeniable mathematics of Alexander's statement. He took exactly 3 steps backward, vanishing into the mass of terrified nobles. Alexander turned his attention back to Clara. The tremor in her lip had completely vanished. Her amber eyes were locked onto his, burning with a fierce, unbelievable clarity. She had survived the predators. She had walked into the epicenter of their power and remained entirely, unbreakably intact. Alexander reached out, his long fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, a gesture of shocking, possessive intimacy that sent another collective shudder through the paralyzed crowd. "The parameters of this estate have permanently changed," Alexander announced, his voice echoing off the marble walls, a decree of absolute, unyielding authority. "The superficial architecture you cling to is hereby dismantled. I have spent my entire life operating within the rigid confines of logic and physics, entirely dismissing the variable of human empathy as a statistical anomaly. I was catastrophically incorrect. True strength is not the capacity to destroy. It is the terrifying, suicidal courage required to protect. This woman is the only entity I have ever encountered who possesses a structural integrity capable of matching my own." He dropped to one knee. The movement was a violent, shocking subversion of every known rule of his existence. Duke Alexander Blackmore, a man who answered to no one, who commanded thousands of acres and bent the world entirely to his logical will, was kneeling on the cold marble floor before an 89-pound scullery maid. He looked up at her, completely surrendering his terrifying intellect to the overwhelming, irrational magnitude of his devotion. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears, though the absolute silence of the room ensured it was heard by everyone within a 30-foot radius. "I cannot calculate the exact depth of my obsession with you, because it expands at a rate that defies all known mathematical models. I do not want you as a servant. I do not want you as a ward. I demand that you dismantle the rest of my life exactly as you dismantled my hunt. Marry me. Become my duchess. Force this rotting world to acknowledge the absolute supremacy of your empathy." Clara stood perfectly still for exactly 12 seconds. She looked down at the man who had terrified her, who had studied her like a biological specimen, and who was now offering her the entire massive machinery of his power. She saw the microscopic vulnerability in his slate-grey eyes, the slight, almost imperceptible tension in his jaw as he waited for a variable he could not control. She took a slow, deep breath, expanding her lungs, her mind calculating the exact trajectory of her new reality. She would not be a ghost anymore. She would be a titan. She reached down, her small, scarred hands gently grasping his broad shoulders, and forced him to rise. When he stood, towering over her once more, she did not look away. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them to exactly 0 inches, her midnight blue silk pressing against his formal black coat. "I will not wear the corset of their expectations, Alexander," she said, her voice clear, resonant, and completely devoid of fear, utilizing his given name for the first time, a shift in protocol that registered like a seismic event. "I will open the doors of this estate. I will feed the starving. I will heal the broken. If you give me this power, I will weaponize it for compassion. Can your logic withstand that level of chaos?" Alexander's lips curved into a slight, terrifyingly beautiful smile, the first genuine expression of joy to cross his features in exactly 29 years. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her completely against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of her heart against his own. "My logic," he whispered, his mouth resting precisely against the shell of her ear, "has already been completely rewritten by your chaos. Execute your parameters, my Duchess. I will annihilate anyone who attempts to stop you." In the exact moment he kissed her, a collision of cold, calculating power and fierce, unyielding empathy, the aristocratic world surrounding them effectively ceased to exist. The grand ballroom, the 340 terrified nobles, the centuries of inherited privilege, all of it was instantly reduced to irrelevance. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, the Blackwood estate underwent a radical systemic transformation. Exactly 412 tenant cottages were entirely rebuilt with proper insulation and sanitation. The estate's kitchens were expanded to produce exactly 3,000 daily meals, distributed to the impoverished surrounding villages. And in the center of it all, ruling with a quiet, invincible authority, was Clara, always accompanied by a massive, fiercely loyal duke who tracked her every movement with obsessive devotion, forever calculating the exact, unimaginable luck that caused a lowly maid to step perfectly permanently into his line of fire.